The Mont Blanc Massif is a majestic mountain range that separates Italy and France. It has 11 peaks that are over 4,000 meters or 13,000 feet high. At almost 4,810 meters, Mont Blanc itself is the highest of them. It was in an attempt to climb its summit along an unexplored route in July 1961 that 7 climbers found themselves in a galling and terrible situation. Not all of them made it back to the mountain's valley. There are several ways to get to the top of Mont Blanc. For example, when climbing from the Italian side, climbers must first conquer what is known as the central pillar of Freney, a huge spike of granite just below the summit. Granite is as hard as it is beautiful, making any climb across it quite a challenge. This route to the top of the Alps is considered very dangerous. Firstly, because it is located afar from tourist trails and residential areas. Secondly, because retreating in an emergency is almost impossible. Freney is a sheer cliff, descending which in poor visibility or with injured team members is hugely risky. Therefore, climbers who want to reach Mont Blanc via Freney must be highly skilled and fully concentrated. In August of 1959, the already well-known Italian climbers Walter Bonatti, Andrea Augioni, and Roberta Gallini managed to climb the lower part of Freney. However, lacking proper mountaineering equipment, they had to turn back. In 1960, Bonatti tried once again, together with various groups of climbers to conquer Freney, but these attempts were also unsuccessful. In the meantime, however, he explored other ascent routes to the Mont Blanc summit. Finding a route that no one has climbed before is a true joy for mountaineers, and it is this desire that makes many risk their lives and choose routes of mind-boggling difficulty. The central pillar of Freney held a special attraction for Bonatti and his partners. At the time, no one had successfully climbed Mont Blanc along that route, but Bonatti was not the only one who decided to attempt it. In early July of 1961, the 32-year-old climber Pierre Mazot and his best friend, the 25-year-old Pierre Coleman, decided to follow in Bonatti's footsteps. Together with 2 other young but experienced climbers, the 22-year-old Antoine Viel and the 25-year-old Roberta Guillaume, they also wanted to climb the central pillar of Freney to the top of Mont Blanc. On July 8, 1961, they arrived at the bivouac of La Fourche. The mountains looked hospitable as befits the summer Alps. The young Frenchman had wanted to set out the very next day, but it was too hot and sunny, so they decided to wait for the weather to cool down a bit. Warm weather in the mountains can also be dangerous, since the heat of the sun can make the snow fragile and unstable, increasing the risk of avalanches. On the night of July 9th, while the group was sleeping, 3 Italian climbers entered the hut in which the 4 Frenchmen had set up their base camp. These sudden guests were Walter Bonatti with his climbing partner Andrea Augioni and Roberta Gallini, a friend of Augioni's. All of them were 31 years old. Antoine and Robert immediately recognized Walter Bonatti. He had long been their idol. During nearly 15 years of his climbing career, Bonatti became a well-known figure, leaving his mark in the history of mountaineering. At the time, he and Andrea had just returned from an expedition to Peru. The climbers greeted each other warmly, and during their conversation, it soon became clear that the 2 groups had the same goal: to reach Mont Blanc via the central pillar of Freney. What should they do? Walter Bonatti tried to be fair. Since the French group was the first to arrive, it was them who should take on the central pillar, while Bonatti's group would try and find a new route. Had everybody listened to Walter's suggestions, perhaps everything would have worked out differently. But Pierre Mazot and Robert Guillaume objected to this plan. They knew about Bonatti's previous attempts to climb this particular route and offered to do it together. Everyone else liked this compromise. It was agreed that the Italians would go first and the French would follow right behind them. They set out the next day, and on the night of July 10th, after the first 300 meters of the route, made their first bivouac on a sheer mountain wall. The Italians had one small light tent with them, while the French group only had a plastic tarp with which they had wanted to cover their sleeping bags to protect them from wind and snow. It wasn't made to protect from severe frost, and the travelers were quite cold that night. The next morning, however, they didn't show any signs of it and were determined to continue the climb. Tuesday, June 11th. Though there were 7 of them, the climbers progressed along the route quite briskly. Walter Bonatti moved first in the chain, while Pierre Mazat went last. Walter soon climbed the second section of the pillar, reaching the so-called chandelle. Mazat and Coleman now went first, laying the rope along the part of the pillar that no one had ever climbed before. The others followed. Finally, all of them overcame a key segment of the route, having nearly reached a convenient ledge on the granite wall. By noon, only about 250 feet remained to the easy snow ridges that will lead them to the top of Mont Blanc. Pierre Mazat decided to lay the rope higher up so that they could go further. While he was banging a peg into the granite wall of the pillar, he had heard a sound that didn't bode well, a crack and a ringing, as if that of a phone. Pierre felt like his fingers were starting to burn. The strike of his hammer set a shower of sparks flying through the electrified air like tiny lightning bolts. This meant a thunderstorm was coming, and that it was already very close. Realizing this, Pierre left his equipment on the peg in the wall and began to swiftly descend to his teammates. At this point, they had set up their bivouac on the ledge, the two groups slightly apart from each other. Soon, rain began to pour. It was so heavy that after only a few minutes, the climbers were completely drenched. Pierre repelled back to the rest of the group just before the first powerful lightning bolts started raining down from the storm clouds. Lightning struck into the crevices of the mountain right next to the climbers, who shook, static electricity running through their bodies. In moments when the lightning subsided and darkness fell onto the ledge, their clothes seemed to glow blue from all the electricity that they had accumulated. Pierre Coleman had it worst of all. He was wearing a hearing aid which was struck by a lightning bolt, stunning the man. Pained and terrified, Coleman nearly fell off the ledge, but was caught by Pierre Mazat. In order to revive their mate, the other climbers injected him with choramine, though other versions say he was given a pill. Pierre came to, but couldn't keep proper contact with his companions anymore, since his hearing aid had burned out. Soon thereafter, he was hit by a lightning again, but his friends managed to catch him by the safety rope. When Pierre came to his senses, he couldn't stop crying, from pain, fatigue, and the realization that he might never be able to hear again. And he loved Mozart so much. His friends tried to support him, inventing a makeshift sign language as they went. This incident would play a decisive role in the fate of Pierre Coleman. The storm raged on for the whole night, lightning occasionally illuminating the freezing and frightened climbers. It was as if Mont Blanc had become a giant lightning conductor, attracting bolts till the very morning. The anguish of death seized us, and we cannot do anything. No movement, no word, only think, yes, of death, and waiting its arrival. It is midnight, but the light is as strong as the light of a blast furnace. At times, we jump, one after the other. One particularly violent stroke pushes our face against the wall, the same that makes the Italians jump. Afterwards, I will find marks on my ankles, small black stars. Flying sparks come out of our hands and feet, wrote Pierre Mazat. Sometimes they go away, and we are relieved. Sometimes they seem to concentrate around us and anguish clutches at us. We are there, full of life, but absolutely helpless in front of this furious outburst of the powers of nature. Near us, attached to the pegs which maintain us above the abyss, all our climbing equipment is suspended. Pegs, crampons, ice axes. One could not imagine better bait for lightning. We would like to get rid of them, but if we do, how will we either get up or go down? We feel a force pulling our legs as if wanting to tear them out. Lightning just skims past. We howl savagely. We're alive. But we know that any moment the storm can reduce us to ashes. I have the strong feeling that we are lost, and it is, I believe, the feeling shared by us all, wrote Walter Bonatti. The next 2 days, July 12th and July 13th, the team stayed on the ledge, waiting for the weather to improve. Thankfully, they had enough food, water, gas, and spirit to stay there for a few days, but no longer. Bonatti was sure that the bad weather wouldn't last more than 24 hours. His experience told him that in the summer, storms on Mont Blanc seldom last long. He was wrong. There was no way of getting the weather forecast in the mountains. At the time, mountaineers didn't carry radios or phones. Nowadays, climbers have access to tons of information about the weather conditions and know everything about wind speed and expected rain. In those days, one had to rely on data about the direction of the wind and atmospheric pressure measurements. The cyclone had swept across a vast expanse of France, brought with it not only rainstorms, but also snow, meaning that climbing the remaining 250 feet to the more convenient ridges of the Mont Blanc was becoming more and more of a challenge. Unable to conquer this troublesome part of the route, the team decided to stay in place for another day. They didn't know that the weather wouldn't improve. Back at Chamonix and Courmayeur, relatives who knew about the storm had started to worry. And when a note from Bonatti saying the two teams were heading for the summit was found at La Fourche, it became clear that the climbers were in trouble. A rescue party was formed, but it could also only start its journey once the weather had cleared up. On the central pillar, the men hardly spoke to each other, tensely waiting for the weather to improve. Only Augioni said to Bonatti, "Remember a month ago we were in Peru, and we dreamed of being on Freney. We thought that here, in our mountains, it would be easier." After several days among the rocks and damp winds, the snow and the cold, Bonatti kept on pondering what to do next. When the storm subsided, hope sprang up, but soon thereafter the wind and snow inevitably returned. Finally, on Friday, July 14th, Bonatti made a difficult decision. They wouldn't stay on the ledge anymore and would instead start the descent. At 3:30 a.m., Bonatti shouted across to the French team, who were sheltering a bit lower, that they should get ready to rappel. The idea was unanimously supported. Exhausted by fear and cold, the climbers were not at all ready to continue upwards along an unknown route. To make the descent easier, they decided to leave some of their things behind. The heavy snowstorms resulted in a number of dangerous snowdrifts forming, increasing the risk of avalanches. Walter Bonatti commended the descent, though he went last. At around 6 a.m., he led the group along the Rochers Gruber, which he knew quite well from his previous ascents to Mont Blanc. Andrea Augioni belayed ropes for the rest of the climbers and thereafter removed the ropes from the route. Climbers must remove their ropes when descending in order to use them again, but removing them is a rather difficult and dangerous task. Several times, the rope got stuck in cracks and ledges, threatening to break. The descent was troublesome. At one point, Pierre Coleman slipped and fell on Andrea Augioni, both of them nearly tumbling into the abyss, but they were thankfully caught in time. The descent continued, but very soon Bonatti ran out of rope. As if by a miracle, He caught onto the safety rope and hung on it, stuck between life and death, until his companions passed him a spare rope and they continued climbing down. In spite of the difficulties, the 7 men managed to rappel back to the lower part of Freney and ended up waist deep in the snow. Moving through fresh snow is hard enough as it is, but especially so when there is so much of it and you're already out of breath. Nonetheless, the climbers continued their journey. Nightfall was upon them, and the exhausted team was hardly able to find a suitable crevice in which to shelter from the wind for the night. They had to huddle in the tiny crevice, and soon the Italian's tent became so stuffy that there was not enough oxygen for the alcohol lamp to burn. Though accustomed to the severe conditions of the mountains, the men dreamt of warm food and a roof over their heads. They thought of home, where there was running water and a warm bed, whereas here, instead of a roof, they had a bivouac and rocks, and instead of warm food, the meager remainders of their supplies, some chocolate, dried fruits, sugar, a bit of frozen meat. All of this they put out on their common table. They craved warmth as much as they craved food. When Pierre Mazot moved, he felt how badly frostbitten his legs were. His friend, Pierre Coleman, had it even worse. His hands were so frostbitten that the skin had begun to blacken. Seeing this, Walter handed him a small bottle of spirit to rub his hands, but Pierre, delirious and losing touch with reality, decided it was a flask of liquor. He began to drink from it, seemingly impervious to the taste and smell, and managed a couple of swigs before Walter snatched the bottle from his hands. Alcohol consumption is strictly prohibited in cases of severe hypothermia, since it can be deadly. How can one warm up then? The gas for the stove had already run out, meaning there was no way of getting water. If only by melting ice in their mouths, feeling it burn, their thirst still unquenched. At night, Walter turned the same thought over and over in his head. Is this really the limit of human capabilities? Have we reached insanity? And Aghioni said, "We climbers are a bunch of fools. There are so many beautiful things in the world, and we drive ourselves into such conditions." The men smoked their last cigarettes while talking quietly, but even in such a seemingly hopeless and terrible situation, there was a place for humor. For example, Antoine Viel jokingly said that it was a pity that they wouldn't know the results of the Tour de France, and that he would not be able to be with his girlfriend Annie again, to whom he wanted to make love as soon as possible. He understood that it was unlikely that the group would be able to descend to Chamonix the next day. How right Antoine was. At 3:30 a.m. on July 15th, the climbers woke up and set out. Their goal for the day was to reach the Gruber Rocks and then the Gamba Refuge. Walter understood that stopping sooner would mean certain death. With him leading the way, the team soon reached the Gruber Rocks, but the slope was steep, and the descent was further complicated by the risk of avalanches. They went on quite briskly, except for Antoine, who fell now and then, and in the end collapsed. One of his mates dragged him along for a short bit, but soon both of them got stuck in the deep snow. Bonatti went ahead, thinking both of them just needed a little rest, but then they couldn't catch up with him. Walter came back to see what was going on. The Frenchmen were standing silently over Antoine. He was no longer breathing. His heart had stopped from all the exhaustion and fatigue. Antoine was the youngest member of the group. His companions lay his body on a tarp, leaving one of Antoine's grappling hooks on his chest. There was no time to grieve. If they wanted to survive, they had to continue moving. Walter Bonatti, almost 10 years the deceased Antoine's senior, finally took command of the descent, not letting anyone stop and leading them down almost purely by touch. The 6 remaining climbers, though tired, hungry, and having just experienced the death of a friend, managed to traverse the Freney Glacier despite the fog. maneuvering between deep cracks in the rocks. After some time, through the white fog, they finally saw the Illuminata pass. This meant that the Gumba refuge was very close. They only had to climb the pass and descend from it on the other side. It even seemed to the climbers that they started hearing the voices of rescuers somewhere nearby. Indeed, the rescue team was looking for them, but they had mistakenly climbed a neighboring glacier and could not have found the climbers in such weather. This was a huge mistake, and a preventable one at that, since everyone knew which route Bonatti's group had taken. So it remains unclear why the rescuers ended up climbing the wrong glacier. As Bonatti's group went on, they decided to drop most of their heavy equipment, leaving only a few hooks, clasps, and some rope. Bonatti and Galini went first, belaying for the rest, when suddenly they were stopped by a cry from Ogioni. He was shouting that he had lost sight of Robert Guillaume. Visibility had dropped sharply. A storm was brewing again, and going to search for Robert was too risky. The climbers made a difficult decision to continue onwards. Later on, rescuers will find Guillaume's body in one of the glacier's crevices. By 11 p.m., the 5 surviving climbers had reached the pass where Bonatti fastened a 50-meter-long rope. There was only a bit left to go. Ogioni was to go first, but he could hardly get back on his feet, and Walter didn't have the strength to carry him. At around midnight, Bonatti suggested that they split up. He and Galini would reach the hut and send rescuers to pick up the others. Having heard this plan, Coleman, who was falling more and more into madness, became even further despaired and enraged. He unfastened himself from the rest of the team and started climbing up the icy slope. Bonatti and Galini went down with him, and their journey, which in normal conditions would have taken an hour, instead took them 3. Pierre Mazot and Andrea Ogioni spent the night tied to a safety hook driven into the granite wall. It was a rough night. At around 1 a.m., Andrea became delirious, muttering something about Portofino. Mazot looked at his watch and then at his friend. The time was 2:15 a.m. This was when Ogioni took his last breath. Bonatti and Galini were not far from the hut. But Coleman once again fell into a panic, mixed with rage and madness. He attacked his teammates because he started imagining that they wanted to shoot him right there on the mountain. In order not to fall with him, Walter decided to untie him from their rope and continue the descent as quickly as possible in order to swiftly send rescuers to help the poor Coleman. At 3 a.m., Bonatti and Galini reached the hut where the other climbers and rescuers were sleeping. Walter and Roberto explained where their companions were, and after receiving help in getting undressed, fell asleep. Meanwhile, the rescue team hurried to the aid of the remaining climbers. At 6 a.m., the rescuers brought in Pierre Mazot, who had almost fallen into a coma on the slope. Andrea's body was still attached to him when he was discovered. Mazot, with tears in his eyes, embraced Walter Bonatti, having informed him of the death of his best friend. The maddened Pierre Coleman died in his rescuer's arms about half an hour after his last delirious bout. In the end, only 3 climbers out of 7 survived. Though the doctors thought their condition hopeless, they managed to prove their prognosis wrong. Italian newspapers, having learned about what happened, raged against Walter Bonatti, accusing him of leaving everyone to die and going into refuge without even trying to save his mates. But this wasn't true. Here's what Bonatti wrote in his book, The Mountains of My Life. I survived. That is all. Maybe because more than the others, I did not want to, nor could, let myself die. Pierre Mazot openly confessed in his book, Naked Before the Mountain, that he owed his life to Walter and that without him, the entire team would have died, unable to descend. Later, Walter Bonatti was awarded the Legion d'Honneur, France's highest award, for his courageous conduct and the fraternity shown during this dramatic enterprise on Mont Blanc. The central pillar of Freney was conquered in August of 1961, only a few weeks after the disaster. Bonatti returned to the Alps many times until in 1965, aged 35, he decided to retire from mountaineering. For his last ascent, Bonatti came up with the most difficult task for himself: the first winter solo ascent via a direct route along the north face of the Matterhorn. In 2009, Walter received the first ever Pilot d'Or Lifetime Achievement Award. Shortly thereafter, the communes of Chamonix and Courmayeur awarded him the title Citizen of Mont Blanc, which suited him very well. Walter Bonatti and Pierre Mazat stayed friends with each other until Bonatti's death on September 13, 2011, in Rome, aged 81. Pierre Mazat became a prominent French political figure and was appointed president of the Constitutional Council of France in February of 2004. He is now 92 years old. The third survivor of the tragedy of Freney, Roberta Gallini, sadly died in a car crash. Besides the books the survivors themselves wrote, there is other literature about the incident in both French and Italian. In 2014, Mont Blanc became the shooting location of the Italian-French film Bianco about the 1961 disaster, produced by Francesco Verga and directed by Daniele Vicari. However, production was stopped as investors decided that films about mountaineering weren't a profitable enough genre. The tragical story of the ill-fated ascent was masterfully recounted by Italian director Andrea Federico in his 2015 documentary called Grimpers, which took 5 years to make. In this film, Mazat answers the age-old question: why do climbers risk their lives? Why do they go to the mountains knowing that they might die? Because they just can't do things any other way. Pierre even says that he envies his companions because they died in the place that they loved the most, whereas he, an 80-year-old man, is likely to die weakened in his own bed. Climbers seem to be a special kind of people who are not afraid of death, love risk, and adore the mountains more than life. Nonetheless, there is a saying among mountaineers: a good climber is an all-climber. What do you think? Share your thoughts about why people wish to risk their lives like this, and subscribe to my channel so as not to miss new videos. Stay safe.